And thank you everyone so much for coming. It's so nice to see continuity of participants from week to week. Everyone can see the screen okay and hear me all right? Great. Last time, we introduced three of the most important early histories. We looked at that of Agathongelos, an anonymous historian whose pen name means messenger of good tidings, and whose history tells what became the canonical story of the conversion of King Turdot's royal court and the Armenian realm to Christianity in the early 4th century. Then we turned to the anonymous epic histories, which have traditionally been attributed to Pastos Buzant, and which tell of the tumultuous political and religious history of the 4th century, rich in Iranian cultural references and details. Finally, we introduce the controversial and compelling history of Moses Khorenatsi, whose famous first book synthesized Armenian myth and prehistory with biblical, Greco-Roman, Assyrian, and Egyptian history and mythology to construct a literary monument of pre-Christian Armenian history. Unlike these authors, who looked back to a more distant past to tell of the great events in generations preceding their own, which led to the making of the world as they knew it, the authors we will consider this evening told of more recent events, which defined their parents and their own generation. What were those great events, according to these authors? It was the lengthy religious struggle of the Christian Armenian noble lords with the Zoroastrian Sassanian Empire, to which those Armenian noblemen belonged and owed their fealty. Our two authors in question are Ghazar of Parpi and Yelisha Vartabed. And you can see on the screen the major English editions. So on the left, published in 1982, History of Vartan and the Armenian War, translated by Robert Thompson, who we've already become familiar with from the other histories. And then there's the new Sophene Books edition of Yelishe. Volume 1 is out so far. Volume 2 is going to be out early next year. And Beon Miloyan translated that. So that has the Kurapar on one side, English on the other. And then for Ghazar, 1991, Robert Thompson's translation. And then Robert Bedrosian's translation, which has been available online for decades, and now is published in book format by Sophene Press. I think volume 1 and 2 are out. If volume 2 isn't out yet, it's to be out shortly. Again, you'd get the Kurapar on one side, English on the other. That we have two authors narrating overlapping material raises an immediate question. What is the relationship between the two? Who wrote first? And did one of them know the other's text? This question has been the subject of some scholarly research and debate. For our purposes, I will follow the view of several modern scholars who see Ghazar's account as the initial one, with Yelishe's written afterwards. In a way, Ghazar's account seems somewhat closer to the events in question, narrating them with more highly articulated historical detail, in higher definition, as it were. But Yelishe is a master interpreter, explaining the events in relation to the outworking of divine providence in the world. For this reason, Yelishe's text has been aptly referred to as a spiritualizing commentary on Ghazar's, providing poignant and profound theological and spiritual reflection and commentary. Indeed, the way in which Yelishe framed the events and interpreted them through the biblical paradigm of the Maccabees led to it becoming one of the works most influential in shaping collective Armenian identity. For a close comparison of the variance in details and emphases between the two authors' portrayal of the same events, you can look at the introduction notes and appendices in these two editions here by Thompson. We're not going to have time in this hour to cover all of this in detail, but Thompson does an excellent job of just that in these editions. We know more about Ghazar as a historical person than we do about any of the authors we have considered so far, thanks to the survival of a lengthy letter he wrote in which he shares some autobiographical details. It's interesting actually why he wrote this letter. As we'll see, he was the head of a monastic community, and a bunch of the brothers complained so much against them. I think they had him removed from the head of the monastery. He was a disagreeable fellow, in their opinion. And so he wrote this letter to defend himself. Usually Armenian, especially medieval writers, are very reticent about autobiographical details, which comes from their commitment to humility and not promoting themselves, or their own selves, their own story, their biography is insignificant. What matters is the work they're doing and everything like that. So he gives a lot of details about himself just because he has to defend himself. So we have some of them for him. Ghazar was born into a family of the middle to low nobility and lived in a village named Parpi in the present-day Aragazodan province of the Republic of Armenia. From an early age, he moved in high society. He was raised as a foster brother and playmate of Vahan Mamigonian, the nephew of Vartan Mamigonian, who later became the Marzban governor of Armenia between 485 to 506. And Vahan was also the patron who commissioned Ghazar's history. Vahan was orphaned when his father Humayak died alongside Vartan in the Battle of Avarair. And so the two children, Ghazar and Vahan, were raised by Vahan's mother, Javik, and her older sister, Anushvaram, and also at the court of Ashusha, the Budeashk of Georgia. What is a Budeashk? This was a high Sassanian imperial office. There were 4 of them, I believe, who were the governors and guardians of border provinces in the Sassanian Empire. So they were sent to the court house of the Georgian Budeashk and raised there. Following a pattern common to the elite writers of his generation, Ghazar then traveled into Greek territory to master that language and its literature. His pro-Greek and anti-Syriac bias is palpable in his history, a product in part of his Greek training. When he returned to Armenia, he lived for a time with the Kamsaragans, another of the high-ranking noble families of the time. He then spent 2 years of intensive ascetic training as a hermit in Syunik, guided by a locally renowned master named Moses. When Vahan was appointed by the Sassanian Shah as governor, Marzban, of Armenia, Vahan recalled his childhood associate from the mountainous caves in Syunik, put him in charge over the cathedral monastery of Vagar-Shapat, Echmiadzin, and eventually commissioned him to write a history that would narrate events from the partition of Armenia between the Roman and Sassanian empires in 387, up to the end of the religious wars between Christian Armenia and the Sassanian Zoroastrians. So at the time that Ghazar was composing the history at his patron's command, Vahan Mamigonian held the leading political position in Persian Armenia as the governor of the country. Vahan was appointed to that position immediately following the Treaty of Navarsock, when the Sassanian Shah finally granted religious self-determination to Armenia, allowing it to retain Christianity as its official religion, while remaining politically and militarily loyal to the Zoroastrian Sassanian Empire. Ghazar, unsurprisingly, goes out of his way to single out for praise the role of the Mamigonians in the struggle, and there are thus panegyrical or encomiastic features to his history. Before summarizing the contents, let's listen to Ghazar situate his own history in relation to those that came before him in the preface that opens his work. He writes, "The first book of the history of the Armenians, which was accurately narrated by that venerable man Agathangelos, commenced with the death of Ardavan, caused by Ardashir, son of Sassan, tyrant of the Stahrajik, and narrated the conversion of the land of Armenia from the ignorance of idol worship to the truth of belief in God. The conversion was accomplished by the holy martyr Gregory, after whose name the book is called the Book of Gregory." Anything look interesting to you in that sentence? So what stands out to me is that the use of the word book to refer to the histories. So it's as if Agathangelos, it's as if there's a great history of Armenia that's one single text. Agathangelos wrote book 1. And then he's going to go on to say Papstos wrote book 2, and he's going to write book 3. Remember we talked about how the Armenian historical tradition, starting with Ghazar, sees it as a continuous whole. So here you see that in its first crystallization. Secondly, he refers to the text of Agathangelos as being called after the name of Gregory. This is one of the reasons why scholars say that the Armenian text of Agathangelos, as it exists now, is a more developed form of an earlier work. Because Agathangelos' history is known as History of the Armenians, not the life of Gregory or the Book of Gregory, as Ghazar knew it, writing around the year 500. Anyway, the second book begins where the first book ends, relating the many changing events, good and bad, occurring in the land of Armenia, the actions and deeds of holy and impure men, and the times of war and peace. All of this continuing to the reign of Diran, son of Arshak, who was the son of Arshak's son Bab, was recounted by a certain Postos Buzantatsi. During his reign, the land of Armenia was divided, torn into 2 shreds like an old cloak. What's that referring to? Remember the partition of Armenia between the Sassanian Empire and the East Roman Empire. That book, which is called The History of Armenia, Pastos, ends with that event. The third history in order is this one, composed in our infirmity. Compelled by the command of princes and the words of the blessed Vartabeds, we committed ourselves to such an important task, not daring to refuse. For we recalled the threatening of the disobedient children in the Holy Bible, and that the obedient and acquiescent are forgiven. One by one, we arranged the events, deeds, and diverse occurrences taking place in the land of Armenia, such as the division of Armenia between 2 kingdoms. In the sector falling to the infidel Iranians were brave men from the line of the Armenian Nakharars, the noble lords, countless numbers of whom gave their lives in martyrdom for the covenant of the Holy Church, while others withstood shackles and prison for a long time out of divine expectation. We describe the beheading of God's chosen priests and upright shepherds who shed their blood for the chosen rational flock of Christ, and those comrades of the Nakharars and other Azads, other kinds of nobles, who turned their backs on the covenant of holiness, becoming tinder for the inextinguishable eternal fire which is awaiting Satan and his satellites. We wrote about all the events until the start of the Marspanet of Armenia of Bahan, lord of the Mamigonians, the great general and Marsban of Armenia. Our history ends there. So Ghazar's history is divided into 3 books or sections, which he calls Turlak. The first picks up where Pastos left off, with the partition of Armenia between the East Roman and Sassanian empires in 387. Using Goryun's Life of Mashtots as a source, Ghazar describes the invention of the Armenian alphabet by Mashtots, making sure to go out of his way to disparage the role of Syriac and give a prominent place to the influence of Greek in the alphabet's invention. He then describes the series of events that led to the end of the Arshakuni kingdom in 428, how the Armenian noble lords requested the removal of Arshakuni king Ardashes IV, according to Ghazar because of his lewd, debaucherous, and vicious habits, in favor of being ruled by a governor appointed by the Shah. They also had Catholicos Sahak removed and had the Shah appoint a Syriac bishop to replace him on the patriarchal throne of Armenia. And you can imagine what choice words Ghazar had for those Syriac bishops. Near the end of Book 1, Sahak has a famous vision in which he sees a period of turmoil for the Armenian realm politically and religiously, after which a time of peace will prevail, when a patriarch in the line of Gregory is returned to the Catholicosal throne, and an Arsacid successor will inherit rule over Armenia. This vision was much referred to in later periods of history by claimants to Armenian political or religious rule, who position themselves as fulfillers of this prophecy. But as Peter Cowie has argued, Ghazar could very well have meant for the fulfillment of Sahak's vision to be seen in the appointment of Hovsep, who was a pupil and spiritual heir of the Gregorid Catholicos Sahak, after a series of Syriac Catholicoi to the Catholicosate, and in the accession to the governorship and hence rule over Armenia of Vahan Mamigonian himself, who was related to the Arsacids, the Arshakuni kings, through his mother, Sahak's daughter. And it's true that the appointment of Vahan is the great climax with which the book as a whole closes, and thus the fulfillment at the end of Book 3 of the vision that came at the end of Book 1 would provide an elegant literary structure to the work as a whole. Book 1 itself ends with the deaths of Catholicos Sahak and Mashtots and the succession of Hovsep to the patriarchal throne. And that's all basically a prelude to Book 2, which focuses on the events leading up to the Battle of Avarar, as well as the battle itself. Ghazar tells how the Sassanian Hazarabed, or chancellor, Mihir Nerse, exploited familial tension in Syunik to conspire with Syunid prince Varazvagan against the Armenian Christian nobility. The two then convinced Sassanian Shah Yazgert to write an edict that would impose Zoroastrianism on Armenia, Georgia, and Caucasian Albania. With the help of their bishops, the lords of these countries compose a reply expressing that while they promise to remain faithful servants of the Shah and support him politically and militarily, they will never accept the Zoroastrian religion. Furious, Yazgert summons them all to court. Before going, Ghazar says the nobles of the 3 countries formed a covenant, ucht is the Armenian word, to remain loyal to their Christian faith. The theme of loyalty to the covenant becomes even more central in Yelishe's history, as we'll see. Despite their covenant, when faced with the choice between death and conversion to Zoroastrianism, the nobles do what? They decide to feign conversion to Zoroastrianism in order to save their lives. They don't sound like heroes, do they? In order to paint his patron in the best light possible, Ghazar goes on at some length about how opposed Vartan Mamigonian was to this feigned apostasy, and how hard it was for the other noble lords to convince him to go along with it. And it's actually fascinating to read the arguments that they give, quoting biblical verses, for why the best thing to do is accept Zoroastrianism right then and there. which goes against everything we know from the Christian martyr tradition, which is you never deny the faith and you gladly go to your death for it. Be that as it may, they ultimately acquiesce to the Shah's demands and bring back Zoroastrian magi with them to build fire temples and spread the religion in the realm. Vartan, planning to migrate his family over to the Roman side of the border, again, another heroic sentiment to run to the other side of the border, where they could practice Christianity free of harassment, is convinced by the other noblemen to lead a military revolt instead. The first battle is that at Avaraj, in which Vartan Mamigonyan and several others die as martyrs, as Ghazar describes them. And in those passages, he does describe how eager they were to go to their deaths, dying in defense of the faith. So you can see why Vahan would have wanted a history to be written to tell the story in a way that would put the Mamigonyans and the other noble lords in the best light possible. How easy it could have been for someone to say, how could we trust you, when you feigned apostasy at the court or this and that. Fighting on the other side with the Sassanians are Vasak, the leading prince of Syuni, and other Armenian noblemen who remained loyal to the Sassanians. This loyalty is presented by Ghazar as high treason, a betrayal of the covenant of unity made earlier to the church and God. By an act of subterfuge, Vasak succeeds in having other princes captured and sent to the Sassanian court, where they are then tortured and imprisoned. But Vasak, who had formerly been promised rule over Armenia for his loyalty, is ultimately rejected by the Iranian court, presented by Ghazar as divine judgment against him. The third book covers the period from around 460 to 484, which culminates in another major Armenian revolt. The revolt in this next generation is led by Vahan Mamigonyan, Ghazar's patron and the nephew of Vartan. Like his uncle, Vahan had also been earlier forced to apostatize to Zoroastrianism and then later return to Christianity. Ghazar's treatment of events in Book 3 is quite detailed, a result of the fact that his patron was the leading figure involved in them. We don't need to go into all of these details now, but it does make for very interesting reading for anyone who wants to go directly to the source. The upshot is that the revolt came to another climax in the early 480s. Thanks to an invasion of the Hephthalites, a Central Asian people that lived across the eastern border of the Sassanian Empire, and also turmoil at the Sassanian court, Vahan found himself in a good position to negotiate. It's in this context that the agreement known as the Treaty of Navarsock was made in 484, where Vahan managed to secure an agreement whereby the Armenian noblemen could maintain Christianity as their religion, while the Armenians would be supporting the Shah in his military expeditions and remaining loyal subjects of the empire. And it's here that Vahan also succeeded in having himself appointed governor of Iran. Governor on behalf of Iran in Armenia, the climactic event with which Ghazar closes his history. And it was unusual for the Marspan, the governor of Armenia, to be a local. Usually it would be someone, another Iranian lord sent from the Sassanian Empire to govern over Armenia. So those are the contents of Ghazar's history and the basic story of them. So the selection that I've chosen for us to read is a passage that highlights, in a very interesting way, the crucial role that's played by women and children in Ghazar's history. After Vartan and the noblemen with him had apostatized or feigned apostasy at the royal court, and returned with magi to impose the Zoroastrian religion on the realm. In this passage, the women and children's faithfulness to the Christian faith is contrasted with their fathers and husbands who had abandoned it. The shame of the Armenian noblemen is compounded by their wives' rejection of them, and the stalwart refusal of the women to give any ground to the Zoroastrian magi, or even let them near their children, which stands in stark contrast to the noblemen's own apostasy at the Sassanian court. So the scene picks up with the return of the Armenian noblemen to the Armenian realm after their apostasy at the Sassanian capital. Then the patriarchs of Armenia and the nobles who were with them reached the Armenian realm, alive yet unwell, living yet half dead, not appearing to be in such health as on their former luminous arrival from such a distant journey. Remember, we talked about how the historians are not so much interested in describing reality just as it happened, but in revealing the inner meaning of events and artistically portraying the deep aspect of underlying reality. So here, they're portrayed, yes, they're alive, but really they're dead inside. So what he's talking about is their spiritual death that happened when they abandoned Christianity. No longer are their faces shining or luminous with the light of Christ, but they're darkened and look half dead. So listen to the irony of the scene. The ranks of Christ's ministers went forth to greet them, bringing the sign of the life-giving cross and the relics of the holy apostle-like martyr Gregory, and chanting psalms which the prophet David had composed by the grace of the Holy Spirit, with whom the nobles themselves had at times joined voices, singing the canticles with more heavenly joy and rejoicing than even the ministers. But now there was heard the sound of weeping and the voice of wailing, cries of lamentation and shrieking. Children, disturbed and frightened, fled in horror from their fathers' embraces, seeing that their appearances were not the same as before, and believing them to have been transformed. Looking always to their mothers' faces, they saw that they were continually mournful and shedding streams of tears. And so the children also took to crying, and no one was able to quiet them, neither their nurses nor tutors. When those who had apostatized, under pretense and not in reality, saw them, they desired to right away draw out their swords and thrust them through themselves. They would have rather not lived a moment longer than see and endure such miseries. They ate the food of joy like ashes, as the psalmist says, and mixed their drink with tears, because no one could be persuaded to sit at table with them. Neither, it's such a funny image, neither wife nor child, neither nobleman, servant, nor attendants. So you know how important the feasting and the banquet is in noble society, especially Iranian, but any noble aristocratic society, and what honor there is in sitting in the presence of the nobleman at table. No one would dare even be in their presence, not even the servants would go into them. Then afterwards, one could see them all divided from one another and torn up. The sweet and pleasant word of the Savior Christ applied to them that said, "There are other sheep not in this fold, whom I must also lead here, so that they may become one flock with one shepherd." This is the true flock that God united, fulfilling what he said when suddenly the enemy kicked and scattered them high and low, making them like a flock without a shepherd. Because of all this, the wives of the senior freemen took to mourning and beating themselves, as did the widows in the squares, the young married women and maidens in locked halls, and brides in their chambers. What are the women doing? Holy bishops with honorable priests and those of the church covenant, old and young, and the whole multitude of congregations raised an outcry, weeping in the house of God. All the faces of Orthodox people could be seen plastered with streams of blood. Why? These are traditional mourning practices that you do on someone's death. And so what Ghazar is doing is portraying how their apostasy is the equivalent of death. And so the women are going in mourning as if they're as good as dead. Meanwhile, the brigades of Magi were speedily compelling fires to be brought into the temple of the Lord's holiness, and to build the fire temples, Adrushank, in other renowned and beautiful places. And they had bearers of wood appointed to tend to the burning fire of the insatiable false god, who in his insensible eating provides no grace to his worshippers, wearing out the licentious, sooty-faced ministers who take the excess waste of the ash heaps outside. So Armenian Christian writers are always making fun of the Zoroastrian Magi because they tend to fire, and they have to take out the wood and the soot and the ash that comes. So there's all kinds of these smears that are made against the Zoroastrian Magi as being sooty-faced or this kind of thing. But the Magi, whom the Armenian nobles had brought with them from the court to be teachers, saw themselves and their religion despised in the eyes of the Armenians. The wives of the nobles, whom the Magi expected to instruct, abhorred even to look at them, and firmly commanded their tutors never to allow their sons or daughters to go to them. While the men, who under pretense made them think they were apostates, did not even allow the false teachers to eat bread in their presence. And so they wandered about miserable and dying of starvation. The images that Ghazar gives are just so funny if you picture them. They didn't dare go away or flee outright, and yet remaining among the Armenians would mean death and destruction. So they made every effort to write in secret to the court concerning the facts of the rebellion. And that's how the Shah then catches wind that, it was actually a false apostasy, and really they're true Christians, and then battle ensues. And that's the part of the story we all know where Barton and the other nobles bravely and valiantly and willingly go to their deaths to die on behalf of, in defense of the faith. So that's Ghazar. And we can talk about these passages or anything else, in the questions or discussion at the end. In contrast to some detailed information we have about Ghazar, Yelishe Vartabed is a figure about whom we have less biographical information. While Ghazar gives a grand sweep of events from 387 to 484, told in a chronological and kind of traditional history type approach, Yelishe narrows in on the Battle of Avarar and uses that singular event to construct a paradigmatic story, rich with theological and moral interpretation that has played an outsized role in shaping Armenian identity and self-understanding from the generation in which it appeared down to our own day. Yelishe builds on several themes introduced already in Ghazar's history, such as unity through the covenant of the church and military martyrdom in defense of ancestral traditions, religion, and way of life, and further develops them in his own. In fact, Yelishe's moral and theological interpretation of events has guided the very structure of his history. Whereas Ghazar proceeded more or less chronologically, Yelishe divides his work thematically into 7 chapters or sections, which he calls heranag, a word with a rich semantic range of meaning that also can be used for a season or mode, like a musical mode. Following a musical metaphor, we might render this as movement, like the first movement of a symphony or even theme. And there's significance, I think, to the number 7 chosen here, which perhaps signifies both completeness and also timelessness. You think of the days of the week or creation. While Yelishe's occasion for writing is a single historical event, I think he intended for his presentation to have universal timelessness and applicability, to become an archetype. And it certainly has been received as such by different generations of Armenians who have applied the text to their own times. In this sense, Yelishe's text stands a little apart from other histories. In fact, he does not even refer to his own work as a history, as Batmotun, instead using the word pan, which we can understand as discourse, refined, stylized literary work. It's another word with a very broad kind of range of meaning. So his text is titled Vasen Vartana Yevhayot Baderazmin, about Vartan and the Armenian War. One of the striking things about the text, indeed, is the series of long discourses that are put into the mouths of the principal characters, as well as lengthy epistles exchanged between Zoroastrian magi and Christian clergy, which become opportunities for Yelishe to theologize and advance his moral vision. Using the external event to unfold or reveal its inner meaning. As he says, by visible means, presage the invisible. It is also significant that the text is presented as being written at the request of a priest named David Mamigon, who's otherwise not known as a historical figure. A text written by a Vartabed at the request of a priest. This tells us a lot already about the purposes for which the author is writing. With some of this background in mind, let's look at the preface to Yelishe's history and listen to him talk about his task and purpose in his own words. At the request of the priest David Mamigon. This is Robert Thompson's translation. I have carried out the work, there you see is Panan, that you ordered, noble sir. You ordered a work about the Armenian War, in which more than a few showed virtue. Behold, I have composed it in the following 7 chapters. That's the word heranag, which again could be theme or section or movement or anything like that. First, the time. Second, the course of events brought about by the Prince of the East. This is a reference to the Sassanian Shah. Third, the unity of the covenant of the church. The Armenian is miapanutun uchtin yegeretvo. Fourth, the secession of some who abandoned the covenant. Zerg baragutun bomans pajanalot zinamin uchte. We're going to return to both of those later. Fifth, the attack of the Easterners. Sixth, the resistance of the Armenians in war. Seventh, the continuation of the troubled state of affairs. In these 7 chapters, I have recorded and set down in complete detail the beginning and middle and end, so that you may read it without interruption and learn of the valor of the virtuous and baseness of the cowards. So here you see his purpose. Not because of any lack in the fullness of your extensive worldly knowledge, but for an examination of the heavenly providence, which in its foreknowledge dispenses the compensations of both sides, and by visible means presages the invisible. So scholars, again, here kind of see how, first of all, Ghazar, he referred to Agathangulos and Paphos Buzant. And you'd think if Yelishe had already written his history, he might have referred to that too, but he doesn't. And here Yelishe specifically says, his main purpose is not to narrate all these events in order so that someone would know them, but he's assuming you already know them. And what he's going to reveal is their meaning in the light of heavenly providence and revealing the invisible reality behind the physical reality of the events in question. That's his task, laid out explicitly. And he goes on, but why would you, who are so versed in the knowledge of God, command me rather than command those far better qualified? As it seems to me, and to you, and to those who have occupied themselves with philosophy, this is a token of heavenly love, and not of earthly vainglory. Just as some of the eminent historians said, harmony is the mother of blessings, discord the parent of evils. And that's actually a quote from Philo. So considering the holy love inspiring your command, we did not hesitate, nor were we discouraged on contemplating our own ignorance. For holiness is many things, including support to weakness, as is prayer to knowledge and holy love to the common advantage. Receiving this support with your command, we willingly accepted this task, which is consolation to friends, hope to the trusting, and encouragement to the valiant as they eagerly assault death, seeing before them the victorious general who is not malevolent or hostile to anyone, but teaches all his own invincible power. That's Vartan. And so you can see how explicitly Yelishe is intending for this text to serve as inspiration for people to read it. Behold, he accepts as a valiant hero whoever so desires. And because the title of heroism is multifaceted, he distributes manifold grace to everyone. And that superior to all we recognize to be the holy love inspired by a guileless mind. This simplicity bears the image of that heavenly simplicity. As we perceive it in you, we forget our own nature. Indeed, we are raised up with you in flight. Like high-soaring birds, we pass through all the harmful, tempestuous atmosphere, and gradually absorbing the pure upper air, we receive knowledge for the salvation of our souls and the glory of the all-victorious church. What's the meaning of this metaphor of going up to soar as a bird? I think you can see it as the heavenly invisible perspective versus the earthly physical one. So again, the focus not being so much on the earthly historical events just as they happened, but on perceiving their invisible meaning. Hence, may the multitude of holy ministers joyously perform the service of their office to the glory of the Father of all. Therewith may also the Holy Trinity rejoice and be glad in his own untroubled essence. So then, having received this command from your generous person, let us begin where it is right to begin, although not eagerly do we bemoan the misfortune of our nation. Indeed, not willingly, but with tearful laments, we shall describe the many blows which we suffered, and of which we ourselves were an eyewitness. So like some of the other historians we've seen, Agathongelos, Moses Choronotsi in a way, claims to be an eyewitness of the things he saw. Most scholars think he actually wrote in the 6th century. But again, if we understand it in another way, he's an eyewitness of their inner meaning, the inner meaning of events, and it's that which he's telling. So we'll highlight a couple of these themes in our discussion, but first we have to talk about the Maccabees, because this book serves as a model for Yelishe. So Robert Thompson, Peter Cowley, and others have shown in very well-written articles and introductions how important the book of Maccabees was for Yelishe, providing him with the lens through which he interprets the events of the mid-5th century. It's not just an inspiration for his work, but a model guiding his interpretation and presentation of the material. So what is the story of the Maccabees? So the books of the Maccabees are found in the deuterocanonical or apocryphal sections of the Bible. First and second Maccabees are the two most important ones for telling the story of what happened. There's up to, I think, 4 Maccabees texts in the Armenian Bible and other Bibles. The basic story is that the Seleucid Emperor Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who is a successor of Alexander the Great during the period of Hellenization across the Near East and Mediterranean. He's in charge over a vast portion of land that also includes Judea/Palestine. He has the idea to impose Hellenization, this is how the text present it, on the region and convert Jerusalem into a polis modeled on the Greek style of cities. Part of what this involves doing so is removing Jewish practice of the Torah and the religious way of life and rules and religion, and replacing it with worship of the Greek gods. The temple is stripped. There's a statue of a god, a Greek god, put in the place in the Holy of Holies. And Torahs, wherever they're found, are burned. Anyone who practices Jewish practices, such as circumcision or otherwise, are put to death. And the children are raised in Greek gymnasia instead of going to, what we could call yeshivas of the time. And so a group of people led by Judas Maccabeus start a revolt. And it's a military kind of revolt. And they do a kind of guerrilla resistance and are actually successful and end up being able to secure their own governance of the region for almost 100 years and reconsecrate the temple. This is what becomes the celebration of Hanukkah, and start a new dynasty there. So this is basically the model that Yelisha follows when telling his history of what's happening. So a small people that is committed to their way of life, which includes their religion and also their other practices and the way they do things. A larger pagan, evil, tyrannical, foreign leader who, for no reason other than to torture and wreak havoc on the otherwise innocent people of God, decides to persecute them. And in the midst of the response of the people of God, there's a cleavage that happens where some stay faithful to that tradition and will die to protect it, and others go on the side of the oppressors in order to advance their own position or promote themselves and make good with the ruling power of the time in order to just advance themselves at the expense of their people and their traditions and their faith. And so this is exactly the model that Yelisha uses. And so we can see it play out in a number of ways. So whereas in Ghazar, as we mentioned, the origin of the conflict was linked with an inter-Armenian noble feud involving dynastic succession in Sunik, in Yelisha, the ultimate origin of the struggle and the conflict is simply the tyranny and oppression of the Sassanian Shah Yazgerd and Sassanian imperial religious policy, which strips freedom, religious and otherwise, away from the peoples under its rule. And so here among other places, he's following the Maccabean paradigm of an unjust earthly tyrant oppressing the people of God, seemingly arbitrarily and for no good reason. While the book of Maccabees provides Yelishe with his interpretive frame, there's only one part of his work where he actually refers to the book directly. But it's in a very dramatic moment of the work after a long speech that the General Vartan gives before the battle to inspire his troops, where he draws on all kinds of Old Testament models and other models. And so after this long speech, Yelishe writes the following. Taking up the brave model of the Maccabees, he read it out to them all, telling them in fluent words of the outcome of events, how they fought and struggled against the king of Antioch for their God-given religion. For although they had been martyred in that battle, yet the fame of their valor has survived to this very day, not only on earth, but also eternally in heaven. Likewise, he recalled to the soldiers how the relatives of Mattathias had split away from the union, returned to the king's service, built temples, offered impure sacrifices, abandoned God, and had received the punishment of death from the holy covenanters. So this would obviously be Vasaksuni and the other nobles who went on the side of Sassanian Iran against the Armenian Christian noblemen. But Mattathias and his companions had not weakened or slackened. Rather, they became even firmer and plunged into war for an extended period. So he spoke, and there on the plain he pitched camp, installed his troops, and gradually built up the cavalry from all sides. So a few of the major themes that Yelishe had mentioned in the beginning are also conveyed in language that build on or draw from the Armenian version of the Book of Maccabees. So let's look at a few of those themes. So the third and fourth Heranag number was the unity of the covenant of the church and the secession of some who abandoned the covenant. So it's worth looking closer at the language in which this is expressed. Unity, mia panutun, with the root mi, meaning one, in Armenian. So he quotes Philo in the beginning as saying, harmony is the mother of blessings, discord, the parent of evils. Unity, oneness, is the harmony and peace on earth that is the church, the people of the one God. With Yelishe's emphasis on unity and harmony, we can understand his monotheist perspective, me, one God. And also the sense of Trinity is conveyed because this is the third movement of the piece. And that's where the harmony is. You can't have harmony with just one thing. It takes multiple. This is contrasted with the dualism of Zoroastrianism, which is typified by secession, division, conflict, and disharmony. Yelishe's choice of word for secession here is built on two Armenian roots, one of which is the word for two, yerg baragutium, with yerg being the root yergu, two, which correlates or signifies, you might think of, the dualism of Zoroastrianism. Those who cause division and bring disorder are dualists, not the monotheists united harmoniously through the covenant of the Holy Church. So those who abandon the covenant are not merely weak cowards, but apostates. As Yelishe says, he'll tell of the valor of the virtuous and the baseness of cowards. So the Holy Covenant, as Yelishe presents it, entails loyalty to God and nation, with a leading role given to the church as the institution through which the various noble houses are bound together. This is especially significant after the loss of native kingship in the land. What else can unite these otherwise separate and isolationist noble lords who all want to pursue their own policy and advance their own position. As Yelisha sees it, only the church. So patriotism, national interests, and Christian faith become inextricably intertwined. There's no other way, as Yelisha presents it. This understanding has been so influential for Armenians throughout history that we, looking back today, can fail to see what an innovation it was in its own time. Obviously, there were whole clans of Armenians who saw things differently, who probably thought it was very natural for Armenians to express their loyalty to the Sassanian Empire by adopting the empire's religion, who would have viewed it as the empire's right to decide what was the official religion of the realm, and were happy to go along with whatever he suggested. That's the basic ancient supposition of empires. For many noblemen, with their aristocratic military ethos, religious affiliation and commitment would probably have been of secondary consideration in most cases. If it would advance the family's standing or position to profess the Sassanian form of Zoroastrianism, many of them probably saw no problem in doing so. It's Ghazar and Yelisha's innovation to separate religious from political commitment and to present the Armenian nobleman's first and primary commitment as being a religious one, to God and the church. And only once that is ensured are they able to freely and loyally support the Sassanian Empire. So the last theme we'll look at is Hayreni Orenk. So this was basically referred to in the Maccabean passage also. We might translate it as ancestral way of life. This is another of the key concepts and terms that motivates Yelisha's history. Orenk, what does Orenk mean today? In Armenian, basically law. But in Karapar, it's a polyvalent term that means customs, way of life, traditions, religion, and law, kind of all at once. So what's customary and traditional, your habits, societally, is your way of life. And thus also in a way, your religion and what becomes the law of the land, if you want to try to connect the meanings all together. In Yelisha, Orenk is often preceded by the modifier Hayreni. You can hear the word Hayr in it, father. So Hayreni Orenk, ancestral or paternal religion, customs, way of life, tradition. This is the key concept connected with the reason for which Armenians made the covenant and displayed heavenly virtue, to preserve their heavenly and divinely bestowed Orenk, that whole way of life that characterized Armenians as Armenians. It was because the Shah attempted to impose Iranian Orenk on the Armenians that they were forced to resist, despite their previous loyalty to the Shah as individual princes and soldiers and the many services that they had rendered to him. Hayreni Orenk refers to more than just ancestral religion, as it's often understood. We have to remember, of course, that Gregory the Illuminator's activity was just 100 years earlier. And we know from other near contemporary sources to the Battle of Avarar, such as Gorium's Life of Mashtots, that much of Armenia remained unchristianized in the mid-5th century. So we can also see the result of the Armenian noblemen as a reaction to contemporary Sassanian imperial policy that aimed for a more centralizing approach to governance, seeking to further integrate the Armenian realm into the empire. Yelisha explicitly mentions an increase of taxes, a loss of liberties, and arbitrary rule by the Shah as reasons inspiring the revolt. It's clear that in the eyes of the Nakharar class for whom Yelisha is the spokesman, it was a time of dynamic political change that was largely viewed negatively by the noble clans. Fighting for their Hayreni Orenk thus also means fighting for their traditional way of life, their right to be a separate and free people, their individuality. Parthian social and political structure was largely decentralized, and thus it is not surprising that the Armenian noblemen reacted adversely to centralizing Sassanian policies. The noblemen had gotten rid of their own king, the Arshakuni dynasty, just decades before, and now they were fighting the Shah, who was trying to impose more direct control over their realm. By means of his creative presentation and interpretation of these complex political, social, religious realities into the biblical Maccabean paradigm, Ghazar, and especially Yelisha, transform a singular historical event into a paradigm and model that transcends the particularities of time and space to apply to Armenians throughout the ages. With their theme of the Holy Covenant of the Church, the authors make the Christian religion as inseparable to Armenian identity as Jewish religion is to Jewishness. They also advance a new paradigm of martyrdom, what we might call heroic military martyrdom. The willingness to be eager for death in fighting to preserve the Haidani Orenk. These paradigms have inspired and guided Armenians from ancient generations up until our very own, as seen here pictured in the most recent war in Artsakh. Thank you.